Hi, welcome to the October 6th meeting of the Kubernetes VMware User Group, where we talk about running all forms of Kubernetes on top of VMware infrastructure. In the agenda for the meeting today, I've nominated topics including recent changes to the vSphere CSI storage driver, as well as recent changes to the VMware vSphere Cloud Provider. We'll cover lightly some of the announcements related to vSphere that were made at the recent VMware Explorer conference. The reason it's light is I think when it comes to Kubernetes, the support for running it on that, well, frankly, even though the GA was originally slated for late September, it got delayed, so it's not even out there yet, and it will take a while for generic Kubernetes distros to support it. But I'm just going to give you some links to where you can learn more about it primarily. And then finally, we'll touch on the discussion of user groups, just because at the upcoming KubeCon conference, there is a session I'm hosting on user group formations. Before we hit record, I was talking informally about this with Scott, but we'll go on during the meeting and go over what's going on there. And I just wanted to see, poll people for anyone on this call who might be physically attending, because we've in the past tried to get face-to-face gatherings just to see, who's there. Sometimes it's nice to actually meet people that you've been meeting on Zoom and meet them face-to-face. So we have an opportunity to do that if anybody is there. So with that said, I composed a PowerPoint deck to structure this. So give me a sec here to open up the PowerPoint deck, and then I'll share my screen. Okay, hopefully, can somebody confirm that you can see that?
Yep, we can see our screen.
Okay. So I already said what the agenda items are. And by the way, we might have time. So if anybody wants to bring an additional item that isn't here, go for it. I haven't had a chance to go look at the agenda notes document to see if anybody formally added an agenda notes doc, but we're so small, you can just light up your mic and do it verbally. So the CSI driver updates, we haven't really had a meeting since June, so it's been a number of months. The 2.60 came out, that added support for Kubernetes 1.24. Also added this enhanced volume topology feature. I'm not sure how many it pertains to, but for people who got started in their journey or running on-prem data centers, this is a feature that would let you land a Kubernetes cluster on a situation where you've got high availability utilizing storage replication to I'll call it a backup data center, if you will. And these are based on active passive storage. So the idea would be that you're backing store for persistent volumes in Kubernetes would nominally be recording to the local one that's hosting everything. But if you had a situation, either a planned or an unplanned failure, let's say you had a hurricane coming in and wanted to potentially set yourself up to fall back on an alternate location, you could take advantage of storage to do this. So it's pretty specialized, and I'm going to publish this deck. I haven't uploaded it to a share yet, but I will when this meeting's over and put the link in the agenda notes doc. I'll also drop it in the Slack channel, but I'd encourage you to follow the doc link because it goes into a fair amount of detail on this, and that's where that picture came from. The other things that made it in 2.6.0 are migration. So this would be for people who've been using Kubernetes for a while, that while being so long that you got started out using the in-tree storage driver. So I think that would put you back at least a couple of years. And if you're now, the fact is you're at some point you're forced to move. So this would be a feature that provides for support of that sort of migration from the in-tree storage driver to the modern CSI based. There is a feature that supports read-write many. So read-write many is something that's been there for NFS for a while. I think it's probably most commonly used for people doing web apps that utilize shared backend storage with multiple writers. So this feature is something that would enable you to do that kind of scenario with a vSAN backing store. And then finally, this last feature only applies to Google Anthos, but well, you can read it there yourself. Supports the storage plugin on a different Kubernetes cluster from the workload cluster. I don't know much about it because I've never run Anthos myself. And you'll see there the links to the deployment files and the release notes. There also were a number of patch releases, including to 2.6 itself. So these fix specific issues, the driver running in a different namespace other than the default commonly used one of VMware system-CSI. I don't know. I'm not going to read these to you. You can probably read them yourself. And once again, they're in the release notes. There are some known issues that I think people do run into these occasionally. These aren't all the known issues, by the way. I just highlighted some that I think people run into more than others. And once again, these known issues are in the release notes. But if you were to upgrade vSphere itself, the underlying hypervisor platform, you might potentially run into this issue. There is a workaround using the kubectl command, but sometimes people, myself included, don't read these release notes and end up in these situations. So I just wanted to call it out. This is another one where a persistent volume fails to detach from a node. A known issue with a workaround, so long as you know the workaround is out there. And the way to avoid getting into this issue is to drain the Kubernetes node before you remove it from the cluster or delete it from vSphere.
That one's very common.
Yeah.
Yeah, I probably had like 50 customers have that happen.
Yeah, I'm not working on the development of that, but it sure would be nice if you made it impossible to handle to happen. But I suspect that it's harder than you might think, because I think that's been there for a while. Anyway, it's there, and I just wanted to call it out because I think it's
especially common. It's especially common with cluster API based deployments.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
It happens a lot there.
I know. I think I've done that to myself too. I mean, just because sort of me, like hobbyist level, educate yourself level, where you throw together clusters not really that attached to them, and you just decide, oh, I forgot where I left off. I'll just blow the whole thing away in vSphere. Anyway, it's there. Moving on from the storage to the cloud provider, the 1.24 came out. Now, this actually came out in, I think, last week of June, but it's been a while since we touched on this subject, so just calling it out there. It the main and only thing I think in 1.2.4 was the support for Kubernetes 1.2.4, but there are a number of subsequent patch things for these issues called out here related to remote auth. I'm not really sure what that legacy paravirtual is about, but anyway, there are links to the issues, and if this thing sounds like something that pertains to what you've got going on, you can go look them up. vSphere 8 was announced in, when it was announced at VMware Explorer, they aspired to putting it out there for download in late September. That got delayed, and it still isn't out today, I believe. I kind of rushed this. I was working on this deck the hour before the meeting, so I didn't have time to actually look at the new date, although you know how these dates are. Whatever the new date in October is, we haven't hit it yet, and my vague recollection is that it might even be within the next week or so, but it isn't yet. And if, I don't know, I'm kind of cynical, and if things got delayed once, they could get delayed twice. And the bottom line is it's not out yet, but soon. In terms of a summary of what went on, I would recommend this Cormac Hogan blog post if you only want to devote like 5 minutes to pick it up. If you got more time, all of the sessions from VMware Explorer are now available. I think William Lamb did the best job of cataloging these. I sort of like it better than going to the official site myself, but hey, maybe you like the Explorer site. Bottom line is you can get these now for free, although to play them, you do have to establish a free login ID and password. But once you've done that, the William Lamb site will give you the titles, vector you directly to the individual sessions, and you can play them at will. There were a few people who, you know, the VMware Explorer ones would be the official, and they're going to run over 30 minutes each and cover them in some detail. If you're looking more towards, you know, watching a 5 or 10 minute version, it was pretty well covered by the usual IT press, and there are a number of those up there on YouTube. So you could go that direction if you want to take it in smaller bites. Since this group pertains to Kubernetes, my own attitude is it's probably not ready yet. I honestly haven't tried to run vSphere 8 myself, and I haven't even checked if in my home lab I'm kind of on some older hardware, so I don't actually know if I could run it if I wanted to. But I'm just calling out that it is out there as an option. I believe that some of the other things that aren't really a technical thing related to Kubernetes is that, you know, vSphere 8 tends to be licensed in a different way and things like that that might have some impacts on how you might go about taking advantage of it too. So that was it for the material in my slide deck. So the final item that I had put on my agenda was talking about what's going on at KubeCon North America. That's in a little over 2 weeks. And historically, we've had a dedicated user group session there, but I didn't actually propose one this time for a couple reasons. One, I was kind of busy with just, I'm also running a Kubernetes related Edge and IoT group. And when I went to KubeCon Europe, I somehow ended up with 5 sessions, and it was just too much and didn't want to do that much again. But also the Kubernetes steering committee itself sort of sent out signals to the people who did these on maintainer tracks that they've spawned so many of these projects that they couldn't even guarantee that you would get a session if you asked for one. And I don't know, to me, that signaled that, you know, they needed to cut back on session count. So rather than even try, I just voluntarily didn't submit this time. However, I've got another session that is a generic session on user groups. And this is the idea that Scott and I started talking about this before this meeting formally started, that in my opinion, this user group isn't as good as it potentially could be because we've got kind of light attendance. You know, when we started this over 2 years ago, who's to say what we expected, but I kind of dreamed that we might get attendance up there, you know, approaching 50 to 100 people. But it never really happened. I think we've probably had a few sessions that we maybe briefly crossed over 40, but the average group probably has been 10. And that might be a signal really that we went too narrow in focus, or that's what I'm thinking. Anyway, I proposed a birds of a feather session on user groups in general for KubeCon. It got accepted and it's slated for Friday afternoon in Detroit. I don't know if either of you are anticipating going to Detroit, but if you are, I'll see you there. And
I won't be attending this one.
okay.
Yeah, me neither.
All right. And the idea there was to cover not just call them online worldwide user groups like this, but before COVID, there were quite a few very healthy local user groups, often on meetup.com, that physically met. Where I live here in Los Angeles, it got so popular that actually 2 user groups were forked, I think, and the attendance was very high. I think maybe 1 or 2 of them got over 250 people. And, you know, with those kinds of crowds, it's tough to get a volunteer venue, meaning some company agrees to host it for free rather than you having to pay for a site. And once you cross over a couple hundred, you know, it's kind of a big deal in terms of what it takes to get a site together and even organize food and beverages if you're going to be, you know, turning it into a social thing. So anyway, in Los Angeles, things got so popular that a West Side and an East Side group got formed because LA is kind of sprawling too, to where if you live or work on East Side, but the meeting's on West, it might take you over an hour to get to the thing. So the Kubernetes meetup groups forked into 2, but then when COVID hit, it just died. And a few of us have been trying to reinvigorate that. However, the companies that used to host it still have lingering hesitation related to COVID here. And we haven't managed to have our first physical meeting group yet. There are a few user group meetings that moved to online very successfully. So one of the people who was active in this group, Joe Searcy, who was with T-Mobile at the time, is one of the co-organizers of the Kubernetes Atlanta user group. And they managed to move online, get good speakers, and get Zooms going that might have had 100 people or more in attendance. And they did very well. Some of the others never really pulled off that successful move to Zoom exercise. And I think a lot of them are potentially trying to get back to physical meetings at this stage. You know, I think that one of the attractions of physical meetings are that people can join these user groups for a number of different reasons. One is to just gain knowledge about the topic, but another one is actually to make social and business contacts locally, because, you know, you can find that these people you meet at a physical meetup might become friends, or, you know, maybe not best friends, but people that you've known for years that you could rely on when you might be in a situation where you're looking for the next job, or, you know, trying to recruit people at your own employer. And those kinds of things I think work better when you've got the social aspects of a face-to-face meeting going on. Anyway, this session at KubeCon that I'm going to be hosting, I'm looking forward to trying to have attendance by both user group organizers as well as users, and just reach out for any ideas people might have. There are going to be people from the CNCF there as well. So joining me will be Taylor, who's the, I think his title is head of community for Kubernetes, or maybe it's head of community for the CNCF, but in any event, he is going to be joining me for that birds of a feather. And we're looking forward to maybe coming up with some ideas for how to best structure user groups under the CNCF. One of the things I'm going to throw out there, but I'm going there more to listen, but I'm going to put this idea on the table that maybe it would be best to structure these user groups along the lines of one for on-prem users and a second one for public cloud users. My thinking being that, this group has been on-prem clearly, but for people doing on-prem on vSphere. But I'm not sure how much delta there is between that and people running on-prem on bare metal or on some other hypervisor solution. I think there are a lot of things that all these people have in common. The need for load balancers would be just one example, but also hosting your own storage, being concerned with implementing your own availability zones. Likewise, there are some things for people who go to public clouds that are similar even across public clouds, like say Azure or AWS. And then of course, there's the people who are doing multi-cloud as well. And that might be a situation where having, a smaller number, like just 2 groups, would get you more critical mass for building attendance, recruiting speakers, etc. And I intend to throw that idea out there. So with that said, I've kind of covered the things I put on the agenda, but we've got plenty of time left if people want to throw out thoughts on anything I've said, questions, or just nominate completely different topics going in a different direction.
Yeah, no, just one thing that I will throw out there that's it's something you had mentioned, load balancers on premise, and it's something that we've talked about a lot here in the group. I think one of the interesting ones that people can take a look at is we've mentioned like KubeVip and MetalLB in the past is lightweight solutions for when running on vSphere. There's actually now Antria, which is an open source CNI, has a service type load balancer implementation itself as well. So if you're looking for another lightweight load balancer solution that doesn't require installing anything else, if that's your CNI, it's worth taking a look at because you can do service type load balancer directly from the CNI without a need for another controller now.
Oh, that'll be cool. I haven't deployed that myself, but sure, I'll go take a look at that. That sounds good.
Yeah, it's pretty easy. I think that's 1.6 or 1.7 of Antria that was added. We're on 1.8 now, though. It is feature gated, so you have to enable the feature gate. But you basically create an IP pool. It is only layer 2, so it's the same network as your nodes, but it will publish the service type load balancer for you. So a really good solution for like home labs or edge vSphere deployments where you don't really have the footprint to run a bunch of things.
It's kind of interesting because that whole, like I mentioned earlier, I'm active in Kubernetes on edge, and load balancer is a tough, it's a challenge there. I mean, sometimes people don't even want to put services on the air from edge that need accessibility from the outside. But if you do, you're typically resource challenged. And, I've noticed things in common there compared to
and
vSphere.
And when you're running on edge nodes, every pod counts. right?
Yeah.
So even just KubeVip, which runs as a daemon set, it's a very lightweight daemon set, but it's still another daemon that you need on every node, plus the cloud controller manager for it as well. It's just extra compute that you don't necessarily need to use if you already have the compute running as part of your CNI.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely worth taking a look at. I've played with it and it works really well. So yeah.
Okay, I'll give that a shot. That intrigues me. I hadn't been tracking Antria for over a year, so I'll take a look at that. I'm running a whole lab now myself and have been doing KubeVip, but you know, historically all of these load balancers kind of go through pendulum swings, I think, too, where you know the one that was sort of leading in popularity a year or two ago has often shifted to a different one, with the original not disappearing for the most part. But it is something where when you give a presentation on these load balancers, that talk probably needs to have a sell-by date of 12 months because things have been changing in that area.
Yeah, that's for sure. I also just shared here in the chat a link to, you had mentioned around CSI and the fun of the volume attachments and persistent volumes that have the tendency to have those issues. Another issue that we've encountered a lot, I just wrote a blog post on this as well with some scripts within it to help. One of the biggest issues that we've seen recently with CSI on vSphere is if you delete a cluster without deleting all the persistent volumes in advance, they all stay in vSphere. And I ended up with over 7 terabytes of leftover vSphere first class disks. And there's no clear way in vSphere UI to actually manage this. There's no bulk option for deleting. There's no filtering capabilities in the UI really that are useful for being able to find these things. So using GoVC actually has some great capabilities in there. So I wrote a blog post on how to kind of pull out a report of all of the persistent volumes, which cluster they're a part of, what namespace, persistent volume claim data that gets bubbled up to vSphere, and was able to clear out 7 terabytes of
Yeah, that sounds great.
volumes.
I'll take a look at that for sure. One thing I wanted to throw out there that I discovered within the last 6 months is when you start reading about these vSphere CLI tools, you know, whether it's GoVC or GoVMami or even the PowerShell things, that I sort of grew up in an era when I think it was because PowerShell became so popular for examples that you felt you had to bring up, for convenience, a Windows node to be running this stuff. But I went and backfilled and tried. These days, PowerShell runs perfectly well on a Linux host. And I went and installed that PowerShell Linux, and you can kind of script deployment of a Linux VM that has all of these tools pre-installed, including the GoVC and GoVMami, to just kind of make a generic control point to be doing all of these utilities that can do things that you can't easily do or can't do at all in the vSphere UI. So I'll take a look at your blog post, but that sounds very useful.
I've had similar things with first class disks being storage vMotioned around, and then you have to go into the mob and resync all the data stores.
Yeah, that's a fun one.
Yeah, it's like if someone has storage vMotion or storage DRS or data store clusters that they put into maintenance mode. Basically anything that's storage vMotion's a first class disk is not good at this point.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not a fun one because it loses its ID basically.
Yeah. I guess it's like the CNS on vCenter and then the controller on vSphere CSI. Like the CSI controller has a database that goes out of sync.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I've had that many times when people forget to set a storage class that targets specific data stores, and it lands on a data store that's in a data store cluster. And then that fun happens.
I guess we're relearning the age-old exercise of always trying to have a single source of truth. Now, in this situation, maybe VMware itself didn't do the world a favor by making that happen forcibly and automatically, but yeah.
Exactly. No, yeah, they lose sync quite often with cases like that. It's things that are known and being worked on, but
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, they've built out a tool internally to like resync them. It's just not fully tested.
Mhm. Yeah, I think, I don't know, some of the original ones had the luxury of being architected in from the beginning. And anytime you add these features late, and also try to support legacy architectures, yeah, it isn't as easy as you might think, as I can say as a developer.
Well, and it's especially for things like vSphere or on-prem solutions where AWS has one version they need to really support, which is the AWS that's live right now. You need to support, you have people still using versions before 6.7, which is why people are still releasing bug fixes for the internal entry provider and 6.7 and 7 and all the versions of 7. And so any new feature that comes in has to be backwards compatible always with the latest supported versions, and it just becomes a nightmare.
Yeah,
To
I think
support.
it's been a while. Years ago, I worked on the backup features in vSphere. And one of the things that makes it even harder than you might think is that people have taken backups of VMs years ago. So even though some of these ancient vSphere releases are, quote, no longer supported, there are people who took VM backups and have a 10-year-old VM backup. And you really do want to give them an ability to recover that backup because, yeah, they're being kept around just in case. In some cases, there's legal requirements for it. And, a key reason for even using a hardware is some scenario where you're allowing things to run even though the original baseline hardware doesn't exist anymore. And some of those things get really tricky.
It's one of the biggest challenges that I've always brought up with Kubernetes backups. And the difficulty of Kubernetes backups is with the speed Kubernetes is moving and the fact that everything is becoming CRDs basically, and they're changing API versions every 2 days, is that at some point you take a backup 6 months later, you may not be able to restore it because those API types don't exist anymore. It's like, I can think of any backup that was taken a year ago, it was probably using V1 beta 1 ingresses. And now that doesn't exist anymore. That can't be restored.
And, I understand the attraction of moving things out of tree and going with custom resource definitions and things. And if you start dragging in those as aspects of what you backed up, and then try to do a restore to a scenario where maybe you even, I don't know, flipped Kubernetes distros or something. Boy, it seems like I fortunately haven't been called upon to do that myself, but I'd start getting really nervous on how well you could expect that to work, if at all. And
exactly.
Maybe
that's
the
where
best.
Some of the backup solutions are working on API conversion capabilities where, because luckily within Kubernetes, persistent storage is persistent storage, because that's just a storage level, right? So that's relatively easy if you're using something like Restic or things like that, where it's literally just block data and you're just shoving it back into a persistent volume. Who really cares if it's moving from Kubernetes 112 to 130? It's, data is data. The API types, there's talks about building in the capability for like doing basically conversions. The issue is there are certain things that you can't convert. There are certain things that are breaking changes, and then what do you do there?
Yeah.
It's definitely like one of those things where it's like a legacy idea that has to be revamped. The same kind of thing we get like very similar things where like you get a vSphere admin who's just adopted like Tanzu or something like that. And it's great for VMware because we've removed the barrier of entry of having to like set up Kubernetes by yourself. But it's also hard for VMware because you get a VMware admin who, typically some people in their org, they won't upgrade for years at a time. But then we have Kubernetes certificates and stuff that is made by cluster API that are, set by default at a year. Yeah. So like we probably had a decent amount of customers have hit that issue because the old sense of like set it and forget it and don't upgrade has now affected them on the Kubernetes level that is set for upgrade all the time and -2.
Oh yeah, and that's not a Tanzu issue. That's overall we see that with any distro. That's going to be Rancher, that's going to be EKS Anywhere, Anthos, do-it-yourself Kubernetes. And if you're doing kubeadm, you're getting 1-year certificates unless you're generating yourself and putting in special flags telling it to use your own certificates. Right, kubeadm is generating 1-year certs, and I bumped into customers that till today are using Kubernetes 1.14. It's like, yeah, good luck upgrading that all the way. You want to go through 10 upgrades right now to get to the latest version? Have fun.
I don't know. Back in the old days with, backup has been in IT for decades. And, there used to be kind of the generic solutions to backup and restore, even rsyncing and things. But one of the reasons the big vendors earn their money for selling high cost solutions is that they had solutions. I'm thinking here in the file system backup, but this might be a scenario a lot like the stale certificate issue, that when you did a high-end commercial and backup thing, you would be backing up whole file systems with user permissions, and a big organization could end up recovering these and restoring the file system with the ACLs, the access controls, granting access only to somebody who left the company or frankly might even be dead, and there's no account left here. So you'd restore the file, but you couldn't read it or do anything with it. And a lot of those commercial backup products would have all kinds of complex controls to recover it while stripping that stuff. And to my knowledge, nobody's done it, but perhaps a proper high-end Kubernetes backup and restore thing that round tripped, it would be part of their job to try to patch in certificate replacements automatically as part of that recovery.
Yeah, or patch in, like, at least for the common CRDs and common resources, patch in API upgrades.
And it was kind of interesting writing the code for even those user substitutions. You'd have to substitute users, groups, maybe in some cases whole organizations, because another scenario that happened in backup is a company buys another company and merges the IT organizations so that the root certificates are just no longer in existence. And I can imagine that there's an awful lot of person years of work to get that to work right, but there's probably demand for it somewhere too. I guess another approach would be just throw in the towel and say, we have no expectation we could ever recover our Kubernetes. We won't even try, but we are running persistent apps. We try to keep everything stateful in databases, and we just back them up at the individual data service level and get to a situation where we can guarantee that's doable, and we don't aspire to even taking on anything more than that. Whether that really is workable or not, who knows? It certainly is. It's where a change of attitude for people coming from legacy worlds.
It's where the regulations need to adapt to that, because I think that's where like GitOps is the right solution for that, right? Like if you're using a GitOps model to deploy, you have Git revisions back. So you definitively have, for your definitions within Kubernetes, if dealing with Kubernetes the correct way through like GitOps, you have a backup in sense of the configuration that was in a cluster. What you don't have is persistent storage, and for things like that, use PG backrest or whatever for, Postgres or whatever the tools are at an application level to do the backups that you need for the data. Right? I think that's where but regulations aren't there, right? So you have people are doing backups of Kubernetes because they're required by regulations to do it, even though they fully understand that in 10 years, there is zero chance that they'll be able to restore that backup because
Yeah.
zero of those API types will exist anymore.
Yeah, and it's tough to have in the old VM solutions, you could pretty much put things together where you could pull off kind of a one button restore. It might be expensive. You might have to buy a ton of hardware to go recover it and stand it up. But I don't really know that the one button thing is doable in Kubernetes these days.
I'm slowly reaching the realization that I don't think it is. And I think that most backups today are just for regulatory purposes and aren't really, like, you have the backup and restore immediately, right? You have that type of a scenario for moving off of one platform to another. You back up, you restore somewhere else, and you're done. They're basically the same version of Kubernetes. Okay, you can solve that. Or you have the short term, 30-day backups. Those are fine as well. But when you deal with long-term backups, I've personally reached a realization that I don't think that that's really feasible within Kubernetes. And I think it's just a matter of my regulations will change in 2 decades, and then we'll see that. Right? I mean, that's the issue, is that the regulations stay in place, even if it's not, even if it doesn't make sense from a technological perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, it could be one of these, if, like you said, you're recording the whole configuration, there's this theoretical thing where, you could maybe bringing it back and getting it alive with certificates would even involve standing up time servers that lie about the time. So that you could get something going that somebody could even at least log on to get in there and get something they needed.
Well, and you'd have to bring up a client machine because your client won't be able to connect to it either because it uses certificates as well.
Yeah.
The fun of NTP and Kubernetes and certificates. It's always a joy. It's always NTP or DNS.
You gotta get a mug with that on it.
I have a shirt with that.
I've seen the DNS version. I don't think I ran it into the NTP, but yeah, I believe it.
Oh, yeah.
So we've got 15 minutes left. We can either end early or open the table.
I have one
Okay.
other question for you, Steve.
Yeah.
I don't know if the idea had come up, but when you were mentioning before, the idea of the user groups really came around when we moved to out of tree from in tree, right? And and it's weird because they're not under Kubernetes 6, but like vSphere CSI, vSphere CPI don't have office hours. Neither do I believe like the AWS EBS CSI or the Azure CSI, which means basically there's no such thing as office hours anymore for what used to be, right? There didn't really used to be user groups. There was always like office hours / working groups for AWS and vSphere. I'm wondering if that's a part of what would be like, I think that there's a level of a user group that's important. And I think there's also a level of a working group of vSphere, which would be a technical, like, okay, what's going on with vSphere CSI, or I'm having an issue with vSphere CSI. I think that those are two different things, but I think that both of them are valuable, meaning I'm not sure which one more people would be interested in. But I think that like if the CSI and CPI folks from different cloud providers had office hours.
Yeah, there were brief periods where I can only speak for some of the ones I was in. So there was aspirationally a period when there were office hours, if you will, for the vSphere cloud provider. But I think what was happening was users would only show up once every 5 months when they had an issue. And between times, the meeting would come up and it would be dead air. And if that happens over and over, pretty soon people are saying, do we really need to have that meeting? Or they stop showing up, so that when that user did finally show up once every 5 months, the right people weren't there and it wasn't ready to fulfill that purpose. I don't know what a great solution is for that. You can sort of get in people's faces if you really need to talk to a dev. correct me if I'm wrong, or you're getting at the idea where you want a sounding board where the people using it could get face-to-face interaction with the developers who are building it, right? Or
I luckily I have face to face, right? So
okay.
I have enough connect that I can turn to an R&D folk of whatever, whether it's, and I'll
Yeah.
also just send something in the Slack channels. I think some people, I'm just thinking from like a user's perspective, I think there are some people who would, like, just for example, some of the open source projects, whether it's Kubernetes, SIGs or other things, some projects are once a month, there's an office hours or whatever. But whereas and then during those meetings, instead of them being dead air, what you see a lot of projects do is that's when they'll do like their backlog trimming, grooming is during that meeting. And then you'll have the developer team there. And if anyone comes that has questions, awesome. And otherwise, it's backlog grooming session, right? So like you use that as a optional session where there's always something that's going to fill it, because backlog grooming, if you're an open source project, is important to do. And having that done in public and recorded isn't a bad thing. But having that place that a user could come to, once a month, they come and ask their questions, gives, I think, a level of what the user groups came to solve at the beginning. I think that's another aspect to it.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I'll bring that up during the Birds of a Feather, because I think, that aspect of bringing the devs and the users together is something that has to happen for the project to work well and be healthy.
Exactly.
I can tell you that strangely enough, the backlog grooming to some extent for the individual CSI drivers, I think, happens in there actually is a storage SIG meeting where I haven't been to one for months, but Saad Ali of Google usually was hosting those. And he would poll people on individual CSI drivers, asking what their status was anticipated to be aligned with the next Kubernetes major release. And even if they're nominally out of tree, it was a central gathering point for all things CSI. And you had devs out of different CSI drivers coming together. And kind of what goes on there, it was kind of interesting because I think there's, even in terms of moving things towards a goal, bringing all of these different CSI drivers together in a meeting is a critical element to get uniformity in terms of when the things they are doing, features they're aspiring to. Because the fact is, if they drifted for a Kubernetes user, eventually, if all of these CSI storage plugins aren't in alignment and are, plus or minus 2 years on feature adoption and things, it becomes a pretty ugly world to actually say that Kubernetes is this abstraction layer that provides a proper spot for cloud native applications that could run anywhere.
Yeah. No, I definitely think that there's, a lot of truth to that. And I think there's a lot of importance of this cross cloud provider, at least knowledge sharing that exists, because you see this with, just like take Ingress as the best example of the failure that has happened, where luckily we're getting back to it with Gateway API now to a good place. But Ingress, you have 100 different implementations of Ingress controllers. Everyone implemented different annotations and different ways to add features that were needed that aren't part of the Ingress spec. So you have different Ingress providers implementing the same core object, but you can't back up a Ingress that was used with Nginx and deploy that somewhere that's using Contour or whatever and expect it to work.
Yeah.
Because the 1,000 annotations that Nginx has are Nginx specific. And same thing with Contour, and same thing with, Kong, and same thing with any of these different solutions. And CSI is that same thing. It's a single abstraction that's core Kubernetes that is being implemented with vSAN specific features and with Google specific features and EBS and EFS and, Portworx or whatever it ends up being, Ceph. And you definitely have that need for some level of commonality.
Yeah. And if you could get users in there to kind of voice the issue with the difficulties of all of this variation, I think that maybe the world would change. But if the users aren't even aware of the meetings, or the meetings don't exist that are appropriate for users to attend, yeah, it would get like your ingress scenario. I could see that happening all over the place.
Yeah, and you see it already now with CSI snapshots, and who supports CSI snapshots, and is it local snapshots or is it remote snapshots, and are they this or like, and you're seeing it already with CSIs with different features that exist at different providers, and you can't necessarily back up or store between providers many times.
Yeah, interesting challenge there, because even if you provided the meeting that would be a sounding board to aspire to uniformity, it's almost like if you look at where things did largely work reliably across vendors, take vSphere storage, for example, it probably requires a compliance test and some sort of mandatory imposition of certification that you really even meet a standard.
Well, and you also don't want to stop someone from creating their own internal CSI driver that works with their in-house storage system, and they don't need volume snapshots. So
Yeah.
Why do they need to implement CSI snapshots, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, there shouldn't be a need for that. But then they're not portable, right? So it's like, what does actual conformant mean? And that's, I think, where like you reach these difficulties, is what is conformant? And conformant could be you're conformant with the baseline, okay, but everything in Kubernetes isn't baseline anymore. I have yet to meet a Kubernetes cluster that doesn't have CRDs in it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, anyways.
Okay, well, thanks for those ideas. I'll bring them up. I know you can't make it, but I'll get there, and at that user group Birds of a Feather, I'll put that idea on the floor and we'll discuss it. Okay, it looks like Kyle had to drop. Did you have anything else, or if you just want to chat socially for a few minutes, I'm around. Otherwise, we can call. Let's do a close.
Yeah, I got to run also, but this has been great, and have a good time at KubeCon.
Bye.
Bye.